Chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us.
Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, and the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And in all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them in the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous, and became the midwives. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but every girl live.
Right. So that's Exodus chapter 1. So just by a show of hands, real quick, if you've read that chapter before or heard that chapter before, raise your hand. Let me just see. Okay, a bunch in here, some not. Very good. So Exodus chapter 1, if you've heard biblical stories in the past, one of the most famous stories in all the Bible is this one that happens, a spoiler alert, but it happens a little bit later in Exodus, where Moses comes and he parts the Red Sea and all the Israelites leave out of Egypt. But we're in chapter 1, and for the next 4 months, we're going to make our way through this Old Testament book. And some of you will look at me and you're like, okay, what? You're going to spend 4 months on an Old Testament book? Yes, and I believe that if you sit in here with us, I know you may not make it every week. We try to put these online if you want to keep track as we go, if you miss a week. But if you come week after week and hear this teaching through this book, and it won't just be me, it'll be other teachers, I believe you'll walk out of here when it's all said and done, and you will be like, this book has changed my life. Really. I think this Old Testament book that you may be like, you're going to spend 4 months on, could actually change your life. And it's really cool. So today, I have 2 goals. One, just for us to kind of go through some of what is happening here in chapter 1, but even more so, set up this series of us teaching through this book. And I'm just going to answer this question: why would you study through the book of Exodus? Because I would like for you to come back, a lot of you at least. And so I'm gonna answer that question: why study through the book of Exodus? I'm gonna show up again the next week or the next week. Why study through the book of Exodus? So that's what I'll be kind of answering today. And it's quite an intro. If you've read this story before, you might need to sort of reset your mind again, because, if you know the spoiler alert, that eventually the Israelites are let out of Egypt, then it maybe doesn't hit quite as hard. This first chapter is brutal. When you sit down and just feel the reality of the situation, it's tough. Look at what is happening right now for these people. So just kind of take your mind, if you will, and reset it again, and just hopefully go back over what you heard in that first chapter. What you felt in that first chapter. It's set up with the first few verses. In the first 7 verses, it told some of the backstory of how we got there. But then it goes straight into what's happening here with Israel, how tough their life is at that moment. This past week, I sat down with a local ministry called City of Refuge. They're doing great work in our community. There's Caitlin. Caitlin is helping us with some of our community care stuff we're doing, and she was with me, and we were just talking through what it looks like, what they're doing on a regular basis. And they feed people on multiple nights. They send home meals with kids who don't have meals over the weekend. And it's great work. But as they told stories, at times it was kind of like, I don't know if I want to hear what's happening, right? I don't know if I want to hear about kids right now who don't have a meal at every meal. And I did the same thing just a week before that. I was at Clark Central, and I was talking with their social worker and just seeing if there were ways our church could partner with them. And the same thing, they were talking about when they had all the needs of the school, and one of the top needs was the fact that there's kids who have housing insecurity. And they said it's pretty common among a little group of them to go couch surfing, meaning they don't have a house to live in, and they do their best to find a couch to stay on for a few nights before they move to the next one. It was hard to hear that. It was hard to hear kids showing up at school that didn't have underwear to wear, and that was one of their main needs. And so I'll just pause there for a second. One thing you'll hear us talk about coming up is we are going to try to do a drive specifically for Clark Central and some of the kids there in the next couple weeks to help out. But as I was listening to some of the needs of our community, it felt a little overwhelming at times. And that's just maybe you're going through that. Maybe there's people in this room that feel that, who are walking in that. If you're not, and you're on this side, you're like, do I turn away? Do I look at it? What do I do? And if you're not going through that yourself, you're probably going through some struggle, right? There's some, if you're not right now, you will. There's something hard going on in your life. It may be loneliness or depression. And when you think about those things, you sometimes just, do I have to look at it? Do I turn away? And then maybe you even get to the question of where's God in this? So again, this first chapter, you start asking that question. Okay, this is a lot. But this is why I appreciate the Bible, because it never downplays the reality of our situation. And it never speaks to some idea that has somewhat gotten out there in some circles, if you will, that there's a spiritual realm in which you can reach, or if you are with God in a certain way, that you cannot have to deal with that. You can rise above all that in some way. In fact, the Bible says the exact opposite. In 1 Peter, Peter addresses the church and he says, look, you're strangers in the world. You're people who don't have homes, and yet times you'll be struggling. You're strangers in the world. In Acts 14:22, Paul says, we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. And so the idea is that the Bible doesn't sugarcoat suffering and hard things. It actually gives us a framework to understand them. And so here's the first reason that I think it's worth it for us to go through the book of Exodus. I think it will help us understand suffering. As we walk through this book, you're going to see a story unfold that will help us in many ways put our minds around how suffering can be a part of our world, and yet there's still a good God who's on his throne. It's not going to answer every question we have on the issue. It's not going to silence every doubt we might have when it comes to this very difficult question to wrestle with. But I think and believe with all my heart that as you go through this book, you'll start to see how some of these things can fit together with a God who's great and mighty and strong, and yet still there can be suffering. So, when you look at what the Israelites are facing right now, oppression, ruthlessness, murder, being controlled by their enemy, a bitter experience of life, why are they going through this? And how is it that the whole reason that they're in Egypt, if you kind of like know the history here, is it seems like God brought them there to begin with. God led Jacob's family into Egypt after Joseph had saved his family from famine. I'll talk about that some more in a second. There's a very respected biblical scholar. I really enjoy reading him. His name is Alec Mater, and he says it like this: "This is the mystery of the divine government of history, whether on the national, domestic, or individual level. The great and loving God is in control, and because he is truly sovereign, he works out his purposes in his way, not ours. He offers no explanations, but grants his people a sufficient insight into his ways, his character, his intentions, and his changeless faithfulness, so that, however dark the day, they can live by faith and be sustained by hope." So this is much of how we will start to frame and understand what is happening in Exodus. We may not get to the bottom of every little reason why all of this is happening, but we will see into God's character and into his ways. I remember watching a baking TV show every now and then, I turn one on and watch it. The kids like watching it. I don't know if any of you like that realm of TV, but the ones where they get people and they're fighting it out for a baking challenge or something like that. And I was watching one of those shows. I really can't remember. I just remember thinking, what are they doing? This is a person who's supposed to know what they're doing, and they're putting this ingredient with this ingredient. I honestly can't even remember. I just remember being appalled at what they were doing, because I don't want to brag or anything, but I'm a pretty good baker myself. So just ask my kids. I'm in charge of breakfast in the mornings. I made them some jam up pancakes today. They were really good. And so if you want to come get some breakfast sometime, you can stop by my house. I'll take care of you. And I was so I'm watching the show, and I'm looking at the ingredients that they're putting together. They're I don't know, something oniony with something sweet, and it was this makes no sense. What are they doing? And you know how you just wish you could taste it though afterwards, when they're cooking it, you're can I just reach through the TV? One day that's going to be a thing, and it's going to pop up in your right there, what they just made. That would be awesome. But as they finished and they made it and they put it all together, I actually started to change my mind. I was oh, that kind of makes sense now. That what they did in their baking actually made sense. And then the judges ate it, and instead of the judges hating on them, they were this is the best thing I've ever had. Now you really want to eat it, right? It's the best thing I've ever had. This is amazing. I would have never thought to put that and that together. It is so good. Well, that metaphor does not work, because it's in a very small time frame in which we kind of see this ingredient go together with this ingredient and it all bake, and even within an hour. But if you take this idea of a God who's working over the course of not just an hour, but days and years and generations, that God oftentimes uses an ingredient over here with an ingredient over here that seems to make no sense. But when it all comes together, you see what God's doing. This is a very important principle of Scripture, that he doesn't always reveal what he's doing exactly right there in that moment, but we'll oftentimes see how it all comes together. Not always, for sure. But at times we get glimpses into how God does this and that and puts it all together. And this leads to the next two reasons for why we're studying through Exodus. Number 2, to help us see more fully the greater story of God. And then 3, is to help us appreciate how God works. So to see the greater story and to see how God works, how he saves. That's why we're studying Exodus. And let me take you through point number 2 here for a minute to get you to think about this. One thing you pick up right away as you go through the book of Exodus is that it's a bit more theological than journalistic, if you will. There are times when you want to know a lot more than what you get. You wish you had some details on this or that, like how did Pharaoh not know Joseph? You know, like when you're reading through there, like how did Joseph all of a sudden vanish from the memory of the Egyptians when he was such a prominent figure? How much time has passed since Joseph was alive? We don't know. But there's a more important message to Exodus that Moses, who has been attributed as the author, wants us to see and know. And you need a little background. Oftentimes, we need a little background. There was a conversation my mom and dad were having one time, and this is kind of going back to, and I was just thinking of this story, but my dad tells my mom all this. He's talking about Matthew McConaughey, okay, the actor. You guys know who Matthew McConaughey is? He's kind of like old now, right? He's the Texas Longhorns guy now. So he tells this long story about Matthew McConaughey, how his car had broken down in Georgia, and people are trying to stop and help him, and I don't know, something happens, and he goes on about how he ate at this place, and then he's going through this whole story, and my dad says, how about that? And my mom says, after all this is done, after this very long story, she's like, well, who's Matthew McConaughey? And my dad's, well, a lot of people say I look like him. That's my dad. And so you need context in the story that we're reading today, just like my mom needed context. You need context in a story like this, that Exodus is a part of a larger story happening. In Genesis, we're introduced to the God who creates everything in the world. He creates the universe and everything in it. And then we're one by one taken through characters who kind of make up the early part of the story. You have Adam and Eve, you have them in the garden, and they sin. Mankind falls to sin, and from that point on, we're in rebellion against God. And you have Noah, and then you get to Abraham. Abraham's a really important figure in the scriptures, and his story is told there at the beginning part of Genesis. And Abraham is just a pagan. He's nowhere near God. He's out there as just another guy, and God comes to him out of nowhere and says, Abram, I'm going to make you a great nation. And out of you, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars and as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And he picks Abram out, and then he goes to his wife Sarah and gives her the same promise. And all this is happening in the teens of Genesis, those chapters where God is coming and he's making a promise. We call it a covenant with him. In fact, there's one point there in Genesis where God performs a covenant ceremony with Abraham. It's really amazing because it was just like any other covenant ceremony of that period where they would take some animals and they would cut the animals up, and they would put a piece of the animal on one side and another piece of the animal on the other side, and they would have this walkway. And together, when they made a covenant, the two people who were making a covenant would walk through that walkway of dead animals that had been sacrificed. And when they walked through there, they would be saying to each other, may our covenant, may our promise to one another be so strong that if we were to break it, we would be like these animals that we're walking through. And so this covenant ceremony that God does with Abraham, you can read about that in Genesis again. When he does it, they don't both walk through, only God walks through. In essence, God is saying, Abraham, I know you're not going to keep your end of the bargain, but I'll always keep my end of the bargain. And God walks through that covenant, making that covenant with Abraham to say, I am choosing you, Abraham, to make a people out of you. And this people goes through his line of Abraham. It's just incredible stories and twists and turns as you go through the book of Genesis. Maybe we'll do that book another fall at some point. But you kind of have to know some of this background information as we get into Exodus, that there's this Abraham guy and Sarah, and then they have a son, Isaac, and Isaac and his wife Rebekah have twin sons, Jacob and Esau. And there's a whole lot of family drama and all of that. And then Jacob passes his promise on through Jacob, who becomes Israel. and he has 12 sons. And one of those is Joseph. And Joseph is a dreamer, and maybe you've heard that story before where, he's like the favorite, and he gets a special coat, and his brothers want to kill him. I mean, lots of crazy family stuff in the book of Genesis. If you think your family's bad, just read Genesis, and you'll feel a lot better. And so the brothers literally like, let's kill him, and one kind of says, no, let's not do that, but like, let's just sell him off. And he gets sold off to Egypt. And so that's how the people end up in Egypt. There's a famine in the land, and Joseph has literally the last few chapters of Genesis focus on Joseph's story, and it says that God put all these things in order the way Joseph sees it because he has a plan for his people to be saved. They would have starved to death, but God has sent Joseph ahead, even though he couldn't have understood how this would make any sense. But he's a slave, and he's at times forgotten in prison. And then he rises to be second in command, if you know the story. And when he's second in command, he has interpreted a dream from Pharaoh to know that there's a famine coming. And he prepares the people for this famine. And instead of Joseph's family starving, they come to Egypt and they're saved. And Joseph looks at it like, God, you know what you're doing. You know what you're doing because I couldn't have seen it. It didn't make any sense, like how you could have been working all this, but somehow you were. And because I'm over here now, my family's saved. And you're feeling really good. Like, okay, this is a great story. And then you get to Exodus and you're like, what happened? Like, God, I thought you wanted to save them. Isn't that the point? Like, God, weren't you trying to bring them out and like save them over here in Egypt, not enslave them? And here they are, being oppressed by this Pharaoh of Egypt. But we're seeing a bigger story unfold, and we have the great privilege now in our day to see an even greater story unfold. What you're going to see as we go through this story of Exodus is how this story, where if you were in the middle of it, you might think it's the end, there's something much bigger happening. And so it helps us because when we're in our own lives and it starts to feel like, God, you've forgotten me. God, I don't know what you could be doing right now. You have hope because you've seen God work, because you see a story like this, because you know that God isn't always done at that point, to know that he is still working, that he still has more to do. And we may not see it in our lifetime, like many people didn't, but we know there's a greater story unfolding. We know that the story of Exodus is a foundational story for the whole Bible. It's hard to overstate how important the understanding of this story in Exodus was to all the biblical authors that will go forward from here. Just one example of that, if you go to the Gospel of Matthew, you don't have to right now, but if you were going to go read Matthew tomorrow, that's one of the Gospels. It tells the story of Jesus. And as you read through that Gospel, you will watch, if you look carefully, you will watch how it unfolds just like the story of Exodus. So I'll just walk you through real quick. So in the story of Exodus, Israel leaves Egypt and comes to the Red Sea. Jesus was in Egypt as a child, and he leaves Egypt with his parents, and the next step in his ministry is to be baptized in the waters. Israel emerges from the seas to go into the wilderness. Jesus emerges from the waters of baptism into the wilderness to be tempted. Israel experiences a time without water and food in the wilderness, as Jesus did in his temptation in Matthew. Israel puts the Lord to the test as they're in the wilderness, walking through all of this, and Jesus never puts the Lord to the test. And Matthew's pointing this out for us. Like, remember when you read through, Exodus, like he's counting on people to know Exodus. He's writing to a Jewish audience. He's like, you guys know the story, and I'm telling you a new story. And Israel arrives at Mount Sinai where they turn to an idol. Jesus is at that mountain, and he insists only the Lord should be worshiped. And so in summary, here are the children of God, as we trace with them through the book of Exodus, who stand in need of salvation. They're failing at every point. And then we have Jesus, as Matthew takes us through his gospel, who never fails at any point, who is perfect and righteous, and shows us what it looks like to be a true and better Israel. So this is where we will watch kind of like a greater story unfold in many ways, not just at the true story level, but also at a metaphorical level. And number 3, we're going to study this book to help us appreciate how God saves. In Exodus, we have God's first great act of redemption in the whole Bible. This is it. We're like, what does God do? How does he work? And in Exodus, we have this amazing act of redemption. This is not just a story of salvation. When we read in Exodus, it is the story of salvation. You might remember the story of the Transfiguration. If not, that's okay. Like if you've never read that story, it's in one of the Gospels, and Jesus is there with a couple of his disciples, and it just like everything goes pretty crazy. It's like he turns into like this almost spiritual being, and Moses and Elijah appear there, and it's like this state of glory. And he's talking with Moses and Elijah. Like how just mind blown if you're the disciples looking on at this, like and Peter later would be like, can we just like make a statue right here, right? Can we like mark this moment? It's interesting that it's Moses who visits Jesus along with Elijah. Moses is a chief character, right? We're about to get to him in chapter 2 of his origin story. It's Moses who leads the people out of Israel, or out of Egypt, rather. And in Luke chapter 9, this is incredible. It says that this is where the transfiguration is recorded in Luke's gospel. He says, behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his exodus, that literally the word used, and spoke of his exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Jesus would pass through the waters of death to deliver his people from the bondage of sin and take them to glory land. So when we read Exodus and you're like, okay, why are we reading this book? It's because it's not just a story of salvation, it's the story of salvation that we get to witness as we walk through this book together. We're going to have communion in just a moment. We're going to sing a song, and then we're going to go to the table and take the bread and the cup. I'll give instructions for all of that. But it's so important for us to understand that when we read here in the Old Testament, it's not like an old ancient book that like, you've probably done it before. You've read one of these books in the Old Testament, you're like, I'd love to read it. I'd love to know the Bible more, but man, this is hard to follow. What's happening here? And I hope as we go through Exodus, like we'll bring life to a book that can be hard to understand at times. We'll bring life to what's happening. And more than that, you'll see Jesus in Exodus. You'll see Jesus in this book. Just like Moses and Elijah say to Jesus, you're about to take the people through a real and true, the better Exodus. And so that's what we're going to celebrate here in a moment. As we take communion, we're going to celebrate that Jesus came for us. And if you have put your faith and trust in Jesus and believed in him, we invite you to take the bread and the cup, the bread that symbolizes his body that was broken for us, and the cup that symbolizes his blood that was shed for us. We'll invite all of you in here. I'll give instructions again in a second, but I'm just kind of setting this up to take of that. If you don't know Jesus, we just would have you just stay seated where you're at. We don't want to make you feel awkward or anything like that. You're welcome here, and like you're great. No worries. But for those who know Jesus, this is for you to take in remembrance of what he's done for you. That bread and that cup was Jesus accomplishing the true exodus for us.